He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at me. Calvin Reed, Director of Strategy, reached across the conference table, picked up my proposal, and tossed it into the trash beside his chair. Paper hit plastic with a dull, final sound. "We're not wasting oxygen on this," he said flatly. "Take it back to wherever amateurs keep their ideas." The room froze. No gasps, no objections. Just the soft tapping of someone pretending to take notes. I stayed seated, spine straight, hands calm on the table, while something hot and electric spread through my chest. Shock doesn't always explode. Sometimes it tightens, compresses, waits. That proposal wasn't a draft. It was months of research, market stress tests, and scenario modeling, the kind of work that never made slides look exciting, but kept companies alive when headlines turned ugly. I had built it quietly, the same way I had built every framework that saved this company from embarrassing reversals no one ever mentioned out loud. My name is Bella Ross, Senior Market Analyst. I was the person executives leaned on after meetings, when confidence cracked and numbers suddenly mattered. I didn't sell vision, I sold reality. Calvin sold something else. He loved words that sounded bold and meant very little. Momentum, scale, disruption. He delivered them smoothly, smiling as if confidence alone could bend markets. Depth made him impatient. It slowed the performance, and nothing threatened him more than work that spoke for itself. He leaned back after the throw, already moving on, already done with me. "Let's hear something useful," he added, eyes sweeping the room, inviting agreement. Heads nodded. No one looked my way. I could have spoken. I could have reminded him how often his so-called breakthroughs required quiet repairs after the applause faded. I could have explained why this proposal addressed risks his language couldn't cover. But I had learned something essential in rooms like this. Once a decision is performed, logic becomes irrelevant. So I stayed silent. The meeting dissolved into timelines and buzzwords. Laptops closed, chairs shifted. As people stood, my eyes drifted to the trash can beside the Director of Strategy's chair. The corner of my proposal was still visible on top, clean and untouched. That was when the humiliation sharpened into clarity. Not anger, not yet. I looked at the trash can and smiled. Just slightly, because I knew exactly what he had thrown away. As that moment settles in, check in with yourself for a second. Are you holding up okay today? If you've been staring at a screen, try the 20-20-20 rule right now. Look at something 20 feet away for 20 seconds and let your eyes reset. Where are you listening from tonight? If this story speaks to you, subscribe and stay with me. What comes next is where the silence starts to work. The exclusion didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, packaged as progress. The calendar invite for the new strategic working group appeared on everyone's screen except mine. And by the time I noticed, the meeting was already underway. No explanation followed, just absence, deliberate and surgical. An hour later, HR filled in the silence. Linda Harper's email was polite, carefully neutral, and utterly hollow. She called it role realignment, a phrase designed to sound temporary while doing permanent damage. I was thanked for my past contributions and assured my expertise remained valued, just not required in the room where decisions would now be made. I had heard that language before. It always appeared right after someone decided you were inconvenient. What made it worse was memory. I couldn't sit at my desk without replaying the nights Calvin Reed had leaned into my office doorway, voice low, confidence cracking. I remembered him sliding draft decks across my desk, asking if something felt off. I remembered correcting assumptions, rerunning models, and quietly removing risks he didn't want exposed in meetings. Each time, the fixes went through. Each time, my name stayed out of sight. Calvin never thanked me. He didn't have to. The company benefited, and that was supposed to be enough. The next week, he stood in front of the executive team, presenting a refined strategy. I recognized the structure instantly. The contingencies, the softened exposure, even the phrasing. It was my work, recycled and polished, delivered with his practiced confidence. My chair was against the wall, invited only as a courtesy. And no one mentioned where the ideas had come from. Watching him take credit wasn't a shock. It was a pattern completing itself. The real humiliation came afterward. Calvin didn't even bother pretending. He spoke about alignment, about decisive leadership, about trimming what slowed momentum. He never said my name, but everyone knew whose influence had been removed. Silence became the official position. By then, the frustration had nowhere to go. I couldn't argue without sounding defensive. I couldn't protest without being labeled difficult. The system was designed to reward composure, not truth. So I stopped reacting and started documenting. I felt the weight of every small compromise I had made to survive there. Each time I chose patience over credit. Each time I corrected quietly instead of speaking publicly. I had trained them to overlook me. The injustice wasn't sudden, it was cumulative, layered, and normalized. What stung most was realizing how easy it had been for them to erase me once my usefulness stopped fitting their narrative of progress. That understanding hardened my resolve, because quiet endurance had limits. And this moment marked the point where restraint finally turned into deliberate action for my own sake. That afternoon, I reread the meeting notes, the realignment email, and the moment my proposal had been discarded. There was a clean line between what the company had accepted and what it had rejected. I needed that line acknowledged. In writing, without emotion. I drafted one sentence. No accusations, no context, just clarity. Just to confirm the proposal discussed is not part of any company initiative. Correct, I sent it to Linda in HR and copied Calvin. Then I closed my laptop and waited, letting the silence do its work. Linda's reply arrived before lunch, short enough to feel dismissive without trying. Correct. There is no plan to move forward with it. No explanation followed, no courtesy sentence, just confirmation, clean and final. I read the email once, then again. Not because I needed clarity, but because I wanted to feel how little it moved me. The anger I expected didn't show up. Neither did relief. What settled instead was something steadier. A calm that comes when uncertainty collapses into fact. The company had spoken. The line was drawn. I didn't reply. That silence wasn't resignation. It was calculation. I had spent years learning when to push and when to let things stand exactly as they were. This was one of those moments. Any response would only invite interpretation. Confirmation was enough, more than enough. I archived the message carefully, labeling it by date and subject, then backed it up to my personal records. No drama, no flourish, just method. I returned to work as if nothing had changed, because outwardly, nothing had. My access remained intact, my calendar still filled. On the surface, I was still employed, still useful. Calvin Reed read that same email very differently. I could tell by the way he started moving around the office afterward. Lighter, almost buoyant. He stopped by my desk less often. When he did, his questions were shallow, perfunctory, as if he were already rehearsing a version of the story where I had faded out on my own. He believed the problem had solved itself. From his perspective, it probably had. The proposal was officially dead. I had been quietly sidelined. HR had confirmed alignment. In corporate terms, that meant closure. He mistook my calm for surrender, and my silence for defeat. I watched it happen without correcting him. There was a strange clarity in seeing how quickly someone could rewrite you once they assumed you no longer mattered. Calvin didn't need to attack me anymore. The system was doing that work for him. Meetings moved forward without my input. Decisions were made without context I once supplied. I became background noise, and I let it happen. Because calm isn't passive. Calm is selective attention. I paid close attention to what was said, what was written, and what was deliberately left out. Every omission mattered. Every confirmation mattered more. Late that afternoon, when the office quieted and people retreated into headphones and half-finished tasks, I stood, walked to the printer, and printed Linda's email. One page, black text on white paper, unremarkable to anyone else. At my desk, I slid the page into a plain folder. I didn't label it with a project name or a department code. I wrote 2 words instead, personal work. That choice wasn't emotional, it was precise. Words create categories. Categories create ownership. I wasn't claiming anything new, I was acknowledging what already existed. I placed the folder in my bag, between a notebook and a paperback I'd been meaning to finish. Then, I shut down my computer and left for the day at my usual time. Neither rushed nor delayed. No one noticed. No one needed to. Calvan went home, believing the situation was resolved. HR considered the matter documented and closed. The company moved on, satisfied that the uncomfortable edge of dissent had been smoothed away. I went home knowing something different. The email didn't end my work, it clarified it. The company had made a choice, and in doing so, it had quietly handed me something far more valuable than approval. It had put the truth in writing. That night, I slept without replaying conversations, without drafting imaginary arguments. The path ahead felt narrow but solid. For the first time in weeks, my thoughts were orderly. Calm doesn't announce itself. It settles in when there is nothing left to debate, only steps left to take. The next morning, quietly. If you're someone who looks deeper than most, don't leave, this next part is for you. Leaving didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, almost boring, which suited me. I followed every step exactly as outlined, because precision was the point. Notice given, access documented, files reviewed, handover scheduled. There were no speeches, no confrontations, no exit theatrics. That was intentional. Noise would have implied emotion, and emotion would have weakened my position. I gave them nothing to react to. HR appreciated that. So did management. Calvin Reed barely acknowledged my departure. During an internal meeting, I was no longer invited to attend. He summed it up for everyone else. Some people just don't fit where we're headed. The comment made its way back to me within hours. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with relief. Relief that something uncomfortable had finally been removed. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't need to. By then, my focus had narrowed to execution. I spent my final days completing documentation, answering questions, and closing loops no one else noticed. Every task was logged. Every file transfer was recorded. Nothing personal crossed the boundary. That boundary mattered. Late one evening, when the office had thinned to a handful of people pretending to stay busy, I opened my personal drive. I reviewed the work I had created over the years, separating what belonged to the company from what did not. The distinction was clearer than most people realized. I copied only what was mine. Original models, independent notes, drafts developed on my own time. No internal databases, no shared frameworks, no material created under their direction. I double-checked timestamps, authorship, and access logs. Everything I saved could withstand scrutiny. That mattered more than speed. When my last day arrived, I handed in my badge, my laptop, and my keycard. No one asked questions. No one needed explanations. I walked out carrying a single folder. Inside it was work they had already dismissed. Calvin believed I was finished. HR believed the process was complete. The company believed it had moved on. They were all correct, in their own way. So was I. Leaving cleanly wasn't about dignity. It was about control. Cold decisions last longer than emotional ones. I had chosen mine carefully. From that point forward, nothing I did was accidental. Every step was designed to hold under pressure. I didn't rush the ending. I prepared for what followed. Outside the building, the air felt no different. Traffic moved, phones buzzed, life continued without commentary. That normalcy was grounding. It reminded me that companies mistake themselves for the world. They aren't. They are environments. Temporary and replaceable. What endures is ownership of your work and your choices. I had secured both. The exit was complete. The preparation was just beginning. I didn't celebrate, because celebration would have implied finality. This wasn't an ending yet. It was a controlled release of pressure. I trusted that pressure to do its work. People like Calvin underestimate silence. They confuse it with absence. I knew better. Silence preserves options. It keeps doors unlocked long after others stop looking for keys. By leaving the right way, I kept every option intact. No accusations, no violations, No loose ends they could pull later. That restraint was deliberate. Cold doesn't mean careless, it means exact. And I had been exact. When I closed my car door and sat for a moment before starting the engine, I didn't look back. There was nothing left behind that belonged to me. Everything that did was already with me. The separation was clean. The intent was firm. Whatever came next would happen on my terms. That certainty carried me forward. I drove home, knowing the quiet phase had ended. The work ahead would be louder, but no less controlled. I welcomed that shift. Cold decisions create space for impact. I was ready to use it. Everything necessary was already set in motion. I simply waited. With purpose and patience, I reopened the proposal a week after I left. Not out of nostalgia, but out of discipline. Distance sharpened things. Away from the company's language and Calvan's constant urgency, the document finally felt like it belonged to me again. I read it slowly, line by line, marking what held and what needed teeth. The core was sound. What it lacked was permission to be direct. I rebuilt it deliberately. I tightened assumptions, removed hedging, and replaced cautious phrasing with clarity. Every scenario earned its place. Every number had a reason. I didn't add anything flashy. I removed what distracted from the truth. The result wasn't louder. It was cleaner, stronger. Honest in a way corporate decks rarely allow. I was careful about boundaries. I used my own laptop, my own software licenses, my own data sources, public filings, market reports purchased independently, notes written long before my last day. Nothing touched their systems. Nothing borrowed their structure. If anyone ever asked, I could explain every input without hesitation. That mattered to me. Integrity isn't just moral. It's practical. Working alone was restorative. There was no one to impress, no performance to manage. I set my own pace, stepped away when something felt forced, returned when the logic aligned. I remembered why I had chosen this work in the first place. Strategy, when done well, isn't about dominance. It's about understanding consequences before they arrive. Somewhere in the process, the frustration loosened its grip, not because the insult hurt less, but because it stopped defining the work. Calvin's dismissal became irrelevant. The proposal didn't need his approval, it needed precision. I gave it that. When I finished, I let it sit for several days. No edits, no tinkering. I wanted to be sure the confidence I felt wasn't just momentum. When I read it again, the conclusions still held. That was when I knew it was ready. I sent it out quietly, to a short list of contacts who respected analysis over theatrics. No pitch, no explanation. Just the document and a note offering context if needed. I didn't chase responses. I returned to my routine and let the work speak. The lessons settled naturally as I waited. Rejection doesn't always mean you were wrong. Sometimes it only means the room wasn't built to hear you. Holding on to your work, refining it without bitterness, is an act of self-respect that compounds over time. The email arrived on an ordinary afternoon, nestled between newsletters and calendar reminders. The sender's name caught my attention immediately. Nathan Brooks, Vice President of Strategy at a firm Calvin liked to dismiss as too conservative. His message was brief. We've been looking for something exactly like this. I read it twice. Then, once more. Not for validation, but for tone. It was curious, measured, serious. There was no flattery, no urgency, just recognition. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. The feeling wasn't triumph, it was alignment. The work had landed where it could be understood. Whatever happened next would be built on that understanding, not on noise. I replied simply, suggesting a conversation and proposing times. Then I closed my laptop. What they had thrown away hadn't lost value in the fall. It had only waited for the right hands. I felt steady again, grounded in my craft. Aware that recovery doesn't come from revenge, it comes from reclaiming your standards and letting them guide you forward. One deliberate step at a time. I didn't rush to label the moment a victory, because rushing distorts judgment. Instead, I noted how my posture changed, how my thinking slowed, how my confidence felt earned rather than borrowed. That shift mattered. It reminded me that progress isn't measured by applause or titles, but by the ability to stand behind your work without flinching. The proposal was no longer a reaction to disrespect. It was a statement of capability, ready to meet scrutiny, ready to travel further than that conference room ever allowed. That realization settled quietly, marking the start of something deliberate and my own. Smart viewers will stay for this part because it changes the whole story. The call with Nathan's team didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like an inspection from the first minute. The tone was careful, professional, and deliberately restrained. No one praised the idea. No one criticized it either. They asked questions instead. Precise ones, designed to map ownership before ambition. That was when the tension settled in. They explained their process clearly. Before any discussion of value, they needed to confirm boundaries. Intellectual property, prior employment, email trails, anything that could surface later and poison a deal. I appreciated the candor, even as my pulse quickened. This was the part where stories usually break, not because the work lacks merit, but because the past leaves fingerprints people forget to wipe away. I told them I understood and invited their legal team into the process. Within hours, requests arrived, dates, draft histories, confirmation of separation, statements of independent development. Each message tightened the space around me. Not because I had something to hide, but because scrutiny always amplifies uncertainty. I moved slowly and deliberately. I gathered what they asked for, nothing more. The email from HR sat at the center of it all, the one line that mattered. Correct. There is no plan to move forward with it, no ambiguity, no conditions. Just a clear acknowledgement that the proposal had never belonged to the company. I forwarded it without commentary. Days passed. Then more questions. Their legal counsel wanted context. When had the idea been conceived? Where had the research been done? Which tools were used? I answered factually, resisting the urge to over-explain. Over-explanation signals fear. I trusted the truth to hold. During that waiting, the tension sharpened into something physical. Every notification carried weight. Every pause felt intentional. I replayed the timeline in my head, not because it changed, but because my mind needed something to occupy it. This was the part Calvin never saw. Strategy isn't boldness, it's endurance. When the follow-up call finally came, the mood had shifted. The questions were fewer, the tone more neutral. Their lead attorney spoke carefully, as if choosing each word for permanence. She confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear. It's clean. The phrase landed quietly, but its impact was immediate. The tightness in my shoulders eased. The anxiety I had disciplined into stillness finally loosened. The work had passed through scrutiny intact. Nothing leaked. Nothing overlapped. The boundaries held. We discussed next steps, scope, timing, structure. I assumed the conversation would turn toward engagement, toward a consulting arrangement or a transitional role. That would have made sense. It would have felt familiar. Instead, Nathan paused. "We'd like to acquire the proposal outright," he said. "Not license it, not retain you, purchase it." The words caught me off guard, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were unexpected. Most companies want control through people. They want the thinker, not just the thought. This was different. I asked why. He answered plainly. They didn't want dependency. They wanted clarity. They believed the value was in the work itself, not in attaching it to a personality. They respected the boundaries I had maintained. Buying the proposal preserved those boundaries. I sat with that for a moment, measuring the implications. Selling meant letting go. No ongoing influence. No seat at the table. Just a clean transfer. It was tense in a different way now. Not fear, but choice. I told them I needed time to consider. We ended the call without pressure, without urgency. When the screen went dark, I stayed still, letting the quiet settle. The due diligence was over. What remained was decision. Whatever I chose next would define the shape of what followed. And that weight felt real, deliberate, and entirely my own. The agreement closed without ceremony. No champagne, no press release, just signatures. timestamps, and a wire confirmation that arrived quietly in my inbox. $8.5 million. Transferred with the same efficiency as a utility payment. I stared at the number longer than I expected. Not because it felt unreal, but because it felt strangely ordinary after everything that had led there. The work had found its value. That was enough. My name never appeared in the announcement Nathan's company circulated internally. The proposal was described as an externally acquired strategic framework. Nothing more. No origin story, no credit trail. I hadn't asked for one. Visibility wasn't the point. Clean outcomes were. I had learned the hard way that recognition attracts questions, and questions invite complications. I signed the final documents alone at my kitchen table, reading each clause carefully, even the ones I already understood. Ownership transferred, liability cleared, no future obligations, no consulting hooks hidden in polite language. When I finished, I scanned the pages, saved them in 3 separate places, and shut my laptop. The silence afterward felt earned. The satisfaction didn't rush in. It settled slowly, like weight redistributing itself after a long imbalance. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The deal wasn't a victory over Calvin or the company I left. It was confirmation that the work stood on its own, independent of rooms that refused to listen. Days passed before I heard anything from my former employer. And even then, it came indirectly. An old colleague texted late one evening, careful with her words. She asked if I had seen the latest internal briefing. When I said no, she sent a screenshot. The headline was clinical, written in the company's usual detached tone, Market Update Competitor Strategy Review. Beneath it, one line was highlighted. Competitor strategy mirrors a rejected internal proposal. I read it twice, then once more, letting the phrasing sink in. Mirrors. Rejected. Internal. Each word chosen to avoid responsibility. The sentence acknowledged similarity without naming origin. Consequence without accountability. It was the closest they would come to admitting what had happened. I imagined the meeting where it was discussed, the careful language, the sideways glances. Calvin explaining timelines, insisting coincidence. I pictured him avoiding specifics, leaning on confidence the way he always had. For the first time. That confidence would have sounded thin. What struck me wasn't satisfaction at his discomfort. It was the precision of the moment. The company had documented its own oversight, not publicly, not loudly, but permanently. That line would live in files, referenced in future reviews, quietly shaping reputations. Accountability doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits until the right record exists. I didn't respond to my colleague right away. When I did, I thanked her and changed the subject. I wasn't interested in being pulled back into their narrative. My chapter there was closed. The money settled into my account a day later. I moved a portion into long-term holdings, set aside another for taxes, and left the rest untouched. It wasn't restraint. It was respect for the process that had brought it to me. Rushing to celebrate would have cheapened it. What lingered most was the quiet satisfaction of being invisible at the moment of impact. They felt the consequences without having a target. No confrontation, no villain to blame, just the uncomfortable awareness that something valuable had been dismissed, and someone else had recognized it. That awareness would stay with them longer than any argument ever could. I slept well that night. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. The proposal had traveled further than that conference room ever allowed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. In the morning, I made coffee and reviewed my notes for what came next. The calm remained. Thoa mantam lang. The kind that doesn't demand witnesses. The kind that lasts. The news reached me indirectly. The way real trouble often does. A former colleague sent a short message asking if I was free to talk. Her tone was cautious, stripped of gossip. That alone told me something had shifted inside the building I had left behind. What she described sounded less like a meeting and more like a containment drill. Calvin Reed had been summoned without warning, pulled out of his schedule, and redirected into a room already occupied by senior leadership. No preamble, no context, just urgency. the kind that doesn't invite preparation. I imagined him walking in confident, rehearsing explanations he didn't yet know he would need. According to her, the CEO didn't waste time. He placed a printed briefing on the table and asked one question. Did we ever review this? The room went still. The document was the competitor analysis, the one tracing how their latest move mirrored something our company had once dismissed. Calvin glanced at the pages, buying seconds. I could picture his mind racing, searching for a version of events that preserved authority. He chose denial. It was half-baked, he said. Casual, dismissive. A phrase meant to shrink the issue and end the conversation. He leaned on confidence, the same way he always had, trusting that certainty would substitute for detail. The tactic worked for exactly 3 breaths. Rachel Moore, head of legal, didn't look at him when she spoke. She didn't challenge his assessment or question his judgment. She asked for something far more dangerous. Show me the email trail. That was when panic entered the room. I wasn't there, but I knew the sequence. Calvin would have stalled, suggesting summaries instead of originals. He would have offered explanations, narratives, context. Rachel wouldn't accept any of it. Legal doesn't debate impressions, it verifies records. The CEO said nothing while the request hung in the air. Silence has weight in rooms like that. It forces truth forward. Calvin tried again. He insisted the idea had never been formalized, never approved, never worth pursuing. He spoke quickly now, stacking claims on top of each other, hoping volume would mask the absence of proof. Rachel waited until he finished, then repeated herself. The emails. My colleague said that was the moment his composure fractured. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough. He stopped, leaning back. His hands came together on the table. His answers shortened. The room felt smaller. It was looped in. Archives were accessed. Messages surfaced. Threads Calvin hadn't considered relevant were suddenly central. The system didn't care about his interpretation. It only cared about timestamps and recipients. I pictured my own email sitting there, plain and unadorned, the confirmation from HR, the line that mattered. It didn't accuse, it didn't argue. It simply stated fact. Correct. There is no plan to move forward with it. That sentence would have landed differently in that room. Calvin's earlier confidence now worked against him. Every assertion he had made was being measured against recorded reality. Each gap widened the problem. The more he tried to explain, the more exposed the contradiction became. The CEO finally spoke again. His voice, according to my colleague, was calm but altered, less trusting. Why wasn't this escalated? Calvin didn't have an answer that fit anymore. He blamed timing. He blamed priorities. He blamed ambiguity. None of it addressed the question. Rachel closed her folder and said the meeting would continue once legal completed a full review. Not an investigation, a review. The distinction mattered. Reviews don't look for villains. They look for exposure. When the meeting adjourned, Calvin didn't leave immediately. He sat, staring at the table, as if waiting for someone to undo what had already happened. No one did. Hearing all this, I felt no rush of triumph, just a quiet recognition of inevitability. Panic loops feed on avoidance. The more Calvin had pushed my work aside, the less prepared he was to account for it when it resurfaced. By the time I set my phone down, I understood something clearly. The room I had left was now trapped inside the consequences of shortcuts. I hadn't needed to be present. The records were doing the work silently. The confirmation didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with documentation. Rachel Moore requested the full record. And once legal makes that request, emotion stops mattering. What matters is sequence. Who wrote what, when, and whether the facts line up when stripped of explanation. According to my former colleague, the HR email surfaced early in the review, printed and placed at the center of the table like an anchor. Correct. There is no plan to move forward with it. That single sentence carried more weight than all of Calvin's presentations combined. It established rejection. It established ownership boundaries. And it did so without opinion. HR hadn't defended me. They had simply confirmed a decision the company itself had made. Calvin tried to talk around it. He argued context. He suggested the proposal was informal, exploratory, unfinished. But none of that mattered once the record was in front of them. The email didn't evaluate quality, it confirmed status. And status is what courts and contracts care about. Rachel asked a direct question. Was this communicated to Belarus? No one answered immediately. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was clarifying. Calvin finally nodded. He admitted the email existed, that it had been sent, that HR had closed the matter. He stopped short of acknowledging consequence, but the admission was enough. Denial was no longer an option. What followed wasn't an argument, it was a recalibration. Legal outlined risk exposure calmly, almost clinically. There was no accusation toward me, no suggestion of misconduct. The timeline showed a clean exit, documented separation, and independent development afterward. Everything I had done sat well within acceptable boundaries. Someone asked whether the company had grounds to pursue action. Rachel's response was immediate. No. That word settled the room. They couldn't claim ownership. They couldn't claim theft. They couldn't even claim misunderstanding. The records were explicit. The company had rejected the work. I had taken nothing proprietary. The idea that I could be challenged legally evaporated in that moment. Justice doesn't always feel like vindication. Sometimes it feels like inevitability catching up. The meeting shifted tone after that. Focus moved from blame to mitigation. How to respond. How to explain. How to participate without amplifying embarrassment. Because by then, something else had arrived. The competitor had sent formal notice of a market collaboration initiative. Not a request. A notification. It outlined scope, timelines, and public framing. My former company wasn't named as an innovator. They were listed as a participant. Participation wasn't optional. The strategy my proposal had shaped was already in motion. Declining involvement would have raised questions they couldn't answer. Accepting meant acknowledging alignment with an approach they had once dismissed. Either way, the comparison would stand. Calvin objected. He argued the optics were damaging. That participation implied endorsement of a direction he had previously rejected. Rachel disagreed. Legal exposure outweighed reputational discomfort. Refusing to engage would look defensive. Worse, it could suggest awareness of oversight. The CEO sided with legal. From that point forward, the narrative changed. Calvin was no longer defending a judgment call. He was explaining why the company had allowed a valuable framework to leave unexamined. That distinction mattered. One was subjective. The other was procedural failure. I learned all this through fragments. Messages from people who had once been careful around me now spoke freely. Not because they were on my side, but because the facts were no longer disputable. Truth loosens tongues. What struck me wasn't satisfaction. It was balance. The system had corrected itself without needing my voice. I hadn't argued. I hadn't escalated. I hadn't threatened. I had simply preserved evidence and let it surface when required. By the end of the week, the company had accepted its role in the collaboration publicly. The internal language softened. Words like rejected disappeared, replaced by deprioritized. It was revisionist, but harmless. The record already existed. Justice, when it finally appears, rarely announces itself. It just removes the ability to lie. I closed my notes and set the phone down, aware that the heaviest work had already been done. Not by me, but by time, records, and restraint. The receipts had spoken, and for the first time, no one could pretend they hadn't been there all along. I learned about the signing later than everyone else, which felt appropriate. Victories like this rarely arrive with announcements. They surface quietly, embedded in routine processes, disguised as paperwork. Calvin Reed was the final approver. His name sat at the bottom of the document, clean and decisive, exactly where authority insists on being seen. The irony wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. The agreement had passed through legal, compliance, and executive review, each layer stripping away interpretation until only facts remained. By the time it reached Calvin's desk, the debate was over. Participation was mandatory. Refusal would have signaled weakness. So he signed. authorizing the very framework he had once discarded without reading. I imagined the moment with clarity. Calvin alone, scanning the final pages, recognizing familiar structure. The logic he had dismissed now formalized, validated, and unavoidable. He couldn't object. Objection required leverage, and leverage requires options. He had none left. What struck me wasn't satisfaction, it was precision. Every step had led here without deviation. I hadn't confronted him. I hadn't argued my worth. I had simply allowed the system to encounter its own record. When the document was finalized, a copy reached me through proper channels. No note attached, no acknowledgement, just the agreement. Complete and executed. I read it slowly, not because I needed reassurance, but because details matter when silence does the talking. Halfway down the final page, beneath dense contractual language, a single line appeared. Small, unemphasized, easy to miss, originally developed independently by Bella Ross. The wording was exact, not credited, not celebrated, simply recorded. That line existed because legal insisted on accuracy. It protected everyone involved. And in doing so, it told the truth Calvin had worked so hard to avoid. Cold victory doesn't come with adrenaline. It arrives with recognition that nothing further is required. I didn't feel the need to respond. The document spoke clearly enough. Calvin's signature transformed the narrative. It erased the version where my work was insignificant. It replaced dismissal with authorization. He had validated the proposal by necessity, not choice. That distinction mattered. I considered how easily this could have gone differently. One emotional email, one public objection, one careless file transfer. Any of it would have given him an opening. Instead, restraint had done what confrontation never could. The company moved forward publicly, aligned with the competitor, speaking in measured tones about collaboration and opportunity. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. The record was complete, for me. The moment closed a loop. The work had returned to the room it was expelled from, carrying my name not as a challenge, but as fact. There was nothing left to prove. Cold victories last because they don't depend on applause. They depend on permanence. This one was etched into contracts, approvals, and processes that would outlive personalities. I saved the document, closed my laptop, and stepped away from the desk. There was no urge to celebrate. Satisfaction would have implied emotion. What I felt instead was finality. I understood then that power rarely collapses loudly. It adjusts, redirects, and pretends nothing changed. Calvin would continue attending meetings, using confident language, and occupying space. But something essential had shifted beneath him. Authority now answered to records, not personality. Every future decision would pass through filters he could no longer control. That realization, more than any apology, was consequence. It meant the system remembered. And systems, once corrected, do not forget. I didn't need his acknowledgement or regret. I needed permanence. And permanence had been achieved through ink, timestamps, and verified truth. That certainty allowed me to step forward without hesitation, carrying no resentment, only clarity about where responsibility ended and ownership truly began for me alone, at last, and on record. Calvin Reed had signed away his ability to deny what he had once tried to erase, and he had done it himself. Pen steady, name intact, under terms he could not dispute. That was enough. Calvin's fall didn't come with an announcement. It came with absence. His name stopped appearing on agendas where it used to dominate the header. Meetings continued, but strategy sessions moved forward without him. Decisions were made elsewhere, documented elsewhere, and presented to him only after the fact. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be challenged. I learned about it slowly, through patterns rather than statements. A former colleague mentioned that Calvin now attended meetings without speaking. Another noted that proposals once routed through his office were being redirected. The title remained. The authority did not. In organizations like ours, that distinction is everything. He wasn't fired. That would have been clean, visible, and defensible. Instead, He was preserved as structure and removed as influence. Committees were expanded. Review layers were adjusted. Final approvals shifted upward, then sideways. Each change was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a quiet cage. What struck me was how quickly the system adapted once permission existed. Calvin had built his position on confidence and control. When both were questioned, even gently, the machinery no longer bent around him. It moved past him. I heard he tried to push back, not loudly. He raised concerns about efficiency, about clarity, about too many hands slowing execution. He framed his objections as stewardship, not self-defense. But the room had changed. The trust he relied on had thinned, replaced by process. Every major decision now required consensus he couldn't command. Every strategic pivot passed through documentation he didn't own. He still spoke the language of leadership, but it echoed without effect. Influence, once lost, doesn't announce its departure. It simply stops responding. The collapse was internal. There were no memos explaining why his role had narrowed. There didn't need to be. Everyone felt it. People adjusted their behavior instinctively, bypassing him without hostility, as if following a new current. The final confirmation came through a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. A senior manager told me the CEO had met with Calvin privately. No witnesses, no notes. Just a closed door and a reckoning that couldn't be shared. According to him, the CEO was calm, not angry, not accusatory. He didn't reference the proposal or the deal directly. He spoke instead about judgment, about awareness, about the cost of overlooking people. You didn't lose the idea, he told Calvin. You lost the person. That sentence explained everything. Calvin hadn't failed because the strategy was wrong. He failed because he dismissed the source. In doing so, he revealed how he valued control over insight. That flaw, once visible, couldn't be unseen. After that meeting, the erosion accelerated. Calvin remained present, but peripheral. He attended briefings he no longer shaped. He received summaries instead of drafts. The organization kept him intact while hollowing out his reach, watching it from the outside. I felt no satisfaction. Collapse without spectacle isn't gratifying. It's sobering. This was the natural consequence of ignoring substance in favor of performance. The system didn't punish him. It corrected itself. There was a quiet dignity in that correction. No villains, no heroes. Just alignment restored. I understood then that the most complete consequences rarely feel personal. They feel structural. Calvin still had his office, his salary, his title. What he lost was relevance. And relevance, once gone, does not return. That knowledge settled gently. Not as triumph, but as closure. The imbalance that began in a conference room had resolved itself without my intervention. The fall was complete because it was internal, irreversible, and unseen by anyone looking for drama. That is how power actually ends. At last. I didn't announce the change when it happened. I simply adjusted my routine and let the days reorganize themselves around a new center. Work arrived differently now. Invited rather than imposed. Measured by clarity instead of urgency. I chose projects with intention, not because I needed validation, but because the work deserved precision. The past company faded into background noise. Occasionally, a headline or a familiar name surfaced, but it no longer pulled at me. What had been resolved didn't require revisiting. Justice, once complete, doesn't demand witnesses. It settles quietly and stays settled. I noticed the difference in my posture first. Shoulders relaxed. Decisions came without rehearsed defenses. I no longer anticipated dismissal or interruption. My ideas existed without needing permission. That freedom wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It allowed me to think forward instead of sideways. People assumed there must have been satisfaction, some private celebration. There wasn't. I didn't win anything that needed to be displayed. The outcome spoke in documents, structures, and corrected processes that would outlast opinions. Quiet justice doesn't glow. It holds. I carried one lesson carefully into this new phase. Silence is not absence. It is a choice about timing. When used well, it preserves leverage, clarity, and self-respect. I hadn't been patient because I was afraid. I had been patient because the truth needed room to surface intact. From time to time, I revisited the proposal that started everything, not to relive the insult, but to remind myself of the standard I worked to. The work had survived rejection, scrutiny, and transfer without losing its integrity. So had I. This stage of my life isn't about proving resilience, it's about practicing it. I don't speak unless there's something worth placing on the record. I don't rush to be seen. Visibility is optional when alignment is real. What I gained wasn't revenge or recognition. It was authorship over my decisions and peace with their consequences. That combination is rare and durable. It doesn't require noise to sustain it. I learned to trust outcomes that arrive without applause, to value processes that protect rather than impress. In that restraint, dignity grows. No one can take it, dilute it, or rewrite it. It becomes internal, portable, and immune to rooms that thrive on noise. That quiet strength now guides every decision I make. Without exception daily, they thought silence meant weakness. It was preparation. I didn't learn this lesson in a single moment. I learned it in the pauses between moments, the seconds when I wanted to speak but chose not to. When my pride asked for noise, and my judgment asked for patience. What this experience taught me is simple, but hard to practice. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to see it. Sometimes dignity means letting the truth move on its own timeline, even when it hurts. If you're still here with me, I'm glad you stayed until the end. And when this story finishes, do yourself a small kindness, step outside for a few minutes. Feel the air. Let your thoughts slow down before you rush back into the day. Where are you listening from right now? I'd really like to know. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, give the video a like, and pass it along to someone who might need it. And if you want more stories like this, told honestly and without noise, consider subscribing. Sometimes, quiet stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.